So welcome again. My name is Alison O'Connor. I'm with CSU Extension in Larimer County, and I serve as the horticulture agent, presenting today with Amber, who's just going to wave, but you'll hear from Amber a little bit later. Amber is our food safety and preservation extension agent, and she is a wealth of knowledge on everything once you get those veggies and herbs out of the garden. So what we'll do today is we have two parts. The first part is growing herbs, and I'll handle that part of things. So how you can plant these herbs into your garden and how you might be able to use them. And then part two will be Amber talking about using and preserving them and getting them safely from your garden to your table. So we did, again, disable the chat. I forgot to update that. We will take questions at the end. And so don't worry if you have questions, we will definitely get to those. At the end of this presentation, we'll convert the recording to a YouTube, and everyone who's registered will be sure to get that YouTube. And then we'll also send you our slides and any other information that we have from, excuse me, CSU Extension, so you can look forward to that. So let's go ahead and get started about growing herbs in Colorado, because we are on the cusp of the gardening season, and I know that everyone is extremely excited for warmer weather and also to get out into their gardens. And so if you haven't grown herbs, or maybe you consider yourself more of an expert herb grower, this is just the basic tips on how to get those plants started in the garden and how to maintain them through the season. The first thing is to talk about what an herb actually is. So botanically, it's a seed plant that doesn't usually produce a woody stem. Now, before you say, well, my gosh, but I consider lavender an herb, and I know that they have woody stems. There are exceptions because plants don't like to stick to categories, and so there are always exceptions. Usually herbs, though, stick around long enough to produce flowers and seeds. But in general, we are using them for their leafy material, sometimes their seeds, but we're using the plant parts. I love Ohio State's definition because an herb is any useful plant. Kind of sums it up and makes it really easy. What I do want to say, though, is that herbs versus spices are really just relative terms. It's not one to get caught up in, and just know that there's a lot of exceptions, and a lot of herbs are spices and spices are herbs, and just know that they can be of benefit to you. The history of herbs is actually really interesting, and so if you're ever bored one day and you decide to Google some information about herbs, you'll realize that herbs are actually, they've been part of our culture for hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. And the way they came to America was our early settlers brought them over from Europe primarily, and they brought these plants with them that they had used for many different reasons. So one, of course, was for illnesses. So we have medicinal herbs that are still used today. A lot of it also was for flavoring food and improving the taste of meat. So if you think a couple hundred years ago when our settlers first started coming to America, obviously we didn't have refrigerators, and meat was kind of a special thing. So they would actually flavor rotten meat, which just makes me gag, with herbs. And so these herbs really have strong, pungent flavors, and they would use them in that way. They also used them to keep clothes fresh because they didn't have washing machines where they could just throw in their dresses or their suits on a regular basis. And they also used herbs a lot for dyeing cloth. And so if they bought untreated muslin or whatever it was that they were using for clothing, they could use herbs as natural dyes as well. So it's a very interesting thing. And of course, we had native plants that were used as herbs from our native peoples that have been here always. So an herb versus a spice, an herb primarily is used fresh or dried, and we generally use the leaves. So a lot of common herbs would be basil, cilantro, parsley. They tend to have a little bit more of a mild flavor, and they're grown in temperate regions, which is why a lot of herbs do well here in Colorado. Our spices, on the other hand, are usually we're using the seeds, the roots, the bark. So cinnamon is one of our classic spices, and of course that is the bark from certain trees, along with some of our seeds like star anise, which is pictured here. We would consider that more of a spice. They tend to have a stronger flavor, and they usually grow more in tropical regions. So if you're growing spices, you probably have a greenhouse or another modified growing environment. They would not do well in overwinter in Colorado's cold winters. But really, they're artificial categories. And for the most part, we're going to talk about herbs just because those are the plants that we can grow, and those are the ones that do well in our climate. The uses of herbs vary. There's generally 4 main categories of how herbs are used. So one is culinary. These are the herbs that we put into our dishes to flavor our meats, which hopefully aren't spoiled. There's the aromatic herbs, which we use for beauty products, for shampoos, for lip balms, things like that, soaps. So the aromatic herbs are ornamental herbs, and really any herb can be grown ornamentally. Maybe you just really like the look of thyme, or you enjoy the tricolor sage as an ornamental. So a lot of herbs can be just grown for their beauty. And then of course we have medicinal categories. And I will say I'm not going to be discussing any sort of medicinal use of herbs, and please don't ask. We are not doctors. Those are conversations that you should have with a medical professional and not extension. So our culinary herbs, to go into a little bit more detail, these are most useful in cooking. And generally we use them in smaller quantities because they can really enhance a flavor of a dish. And so one thing I love to do is make roasted potatoes and use rosemary. Well, I have been a little heavy-handed with my rosemary in the past, and those potatoes generally get just a little bit too strong, especially as herbs dry, they can really get a stronger flavor. Some of our most popular culinary herbs include parsley, sage, I'm not going to say thyme, but just know parsley, sage, chives, and then we do have savory, marjoram, oregano. All of those are very good culinary herbs. So you can envision pots of soup and Thanksgiving dinner with, the flavors you would use to season poultry and other things like that. So culinary herbs are a very common garden plant. Some of our most common aromatics, and of course they can overlap and also be culinary, but these are ones that have pleasant smelling flowers or foliage. So lavender is the poster child for our aromatic herbs. The oils from these plants can be used to scent perfumes and soaps and toilet water. And toilet water is a type of perfume. It's just not nearly as concentrated. So it's a little bit of a lighter fragrance. Examples of aromatics include mint, marjoram, rosemary, and then of course lavender and basil. So that's really interesting. But some of you may have run across basil scented soaps or shampoos or things like that. And it really just depends on your personal preference of what you enjoy using in your beauty products and what you enjoy eating. Our ornamental herbs, and again, I said any herb can be grown as an ornamental. You don't have to plant basil to use it. You can just plant basil just to have it in your garden because it's a really easy, nice scented plant. But our ornamentals tend to have more brightly colored flowers and foliage. So creeping thyme, which is the plant featured here as the lawn area, is one of our great ornamental herbs. Some other plants you could use them in pots or containers to add some accents. Mint is a great plant to keep in a container and not put in the garden simply because it gets completely out of control. So that's a nice one. And if you don't want to use mint for the foliage, you could let it flower and enjoy those white or pinkish flowers that it has. Some others to consider would be thyme. So we have both ornamental thyme and we have culinary thyme. It is important to know which thyme you're planting depending on the use because you wouldn't want to eat creeping thyme. It is not edible. Sage, mint, and chives are also considered to be ornamental, and I love chives. Chives are wonderful. They're so cute. They bloom early in the spring, and they really are a great ornamental feature. Moving into the life cycles of herbs, annuals are plants that complete their entire life cycle in just one growing season. So this is similar to our annual flowers like petunias or impatiens or coleus. So annuals will go from seed to foliage to flower to seed in one growing season. And we have a number of herbs that are actual annuals. Perennials are plants that come back year after year, so they have a perennial growth pattern. They do overwinter, and usually the foliage dies back to the crown, and then the plant regrows each spring from the crown of the plant. We also have some herbs that are considered biennials, and what this means is that they have a 2-year life cycle. So the first season is foliage, and that's generally when we would harvest these plants. And then the second season is when it would bloom. Parsley is a great example of a biennial plant. So if you've ever had parsley over winter, and it does, surprisingly, in Colorado, it does overwinter. The first season, you'll have all that wonderful foliage that you can add as a garnish or to your soup. And then the second season, it will flower. And the taste of parsley really gets bad when it's in flower. So you do need to remember to use it accordingly. A couple of annual herbs: basil, chervil, coriander, or cilantro. Those are actually the same plant. Coriander is just the mature seed from the cilantro plant. And then dill. So you may think, oh my gosh, I have dill every year, but actually dill is an annual. It just reseeds so prolifically that once you plant dill, you will always have dill. Fortunately, dill is a really wonderful herb with kind of a mild flavor, and you can use it for so many different things. But just know that just because they're annual doesn't mean they're well behaved. And the whole purpose of plants, if you think about it from the plant perspective, is to survive year after year. And so if you get killed by a frost, your goal as a plant is to flower and set seeds so that those seeds will grow next year. What we do as gardeners is we manipulate the growth and usually pinch off the flowers or try to control things so we don't have those plants year after year because they can get weedy. Perennial herbs include chives, which I've mentioned. Again, chives are just adorable. They're a wonderful plant, so easy to maintain. Fennel is another perennial herb. Mint, as I've mentioned, and we'll get into more of the details of how to grow each of these herbs. I'm just giving you a little brief introduction. Thyme and then sage are all great perennial herbs. So these, again, are plants that will overwinter year after year in Colorado and do really well for you. And they can be grown as an ornamental, as a culinary, whatever you do decide. Just be sure that you're planting them and siting them appropriately. A couple of biennial herbs I mentioned: parsley. Caraway is also another biennial herb. So remember that, again, that these are plants that have a 2-year cycle. So the first year is foliage, and then the second year is the flower and the seed. So those are our biennial herbs that you might encounter. When it comes down to gardening with herbs, it really comes down to your preference. What do you want to grow? What do you like? What tastes good to you? If you can't stand the taste of rosemary, then I probably wouldn't recommend that you grow rosemary. But maybe you love to grow thyme, or maybe you use sage in a lot of different places. Those are then plants that you should really focus on. So think about what flavors you like, the type of palate that you have, and then also what kind of dishes are you making and what herbs are commonly associated with those dishes. Also consider what scents you like, because again, if you're not necessarily using these plants for culinary use or aromatics, but you just want to grow them in the garden, when you walk by and you reach down and you grab the plant and then sniff your fingers, what is appealing to you? I have a coworker in Adams County who cannot stand the scent of lavender because it was something that she had growing up, and it always reminded her of having a headache for some reason. So she doesn't like the scent of lavender. So that's not a plant she would include in her landscape. And after you've made those decisions, that's when you then would visit a nursery or a garden center. A lot of these will be ready now, especially our perennial plants. For the annuals like basil and things like that, please just wait a few more weeks. A lot of our annuals are not going to do well until we're well out of the woods of having a freeze event, which I know everybody thinks is around the middle of May. But if you can wait until Memorial Day or even June 1st to plant some of those warmer, loving plants like your tomatoes, basil, peppers, you're going to have better success. So just consider that. But your perennial plants could actually go in the garden now and do quite well with the spring weather. If you're a beginning gardener and you just want to grow a few herbs just to see how you do, you can consider some of these. So if you want something more strong flavored, consider the winter savory, rosemary, and sage. Now, rosemary is one that does have woody plant parts. It is one that will not overwinter in Colorado. Sage will, however. So if you want to put sage in your outdoor garden and leave it there, it's going to do well year after year. Rosemary is kind of a problem child, and we'll talk about that. But to grow it in the summer, really no problem at all. If you want herbs for more accent flavors, you can consider a lot of the basils. So there's sweet basil, which is the one that you likely associate most with Italian dishes and maybe pesto. There's also Thai basils, and they have maybe a bit more of a lemony scent. Dill is a very easy one, and remember, dill is one that if you plant dill, you will always have dill. Mint, tarragon, which has more of a licorice flavor, like an anise flavor, thyme, and lovage. Those are all great accent flavors. And then if you're just looking for some more herbs that you can blend that maybe don't have as strong a flavor, you're looking to make your own spice mixes or herb mixes, which Amber will talk about, you can do some chives, parsley, and then the summer savory. So winter savory and summer savory do have different flavors, and the winter is a little bit more strong. You can easily combine your herbs with your vegetables. And so if you're starting a vegetable garden, or maybe you've had an established vegetable garden, it is an easy thing to do. So while you're picking your tomatoes, you could also pick some basil. You can make a great Italian garden, and you could go from there. They also combine really well with perennials. And so if you have a perennial garden filled with daylilies and coral bells and other plants, stick some chives in there because they're perennial. Stick some thyme in there because that's a perennial. You could also consider the sages, and that would look really beautiful. And really what you should think about is to make sure that you're planting these plants near your kitchen or a door for quick access. If you plant your herb garden across the backyard and you have to troop all the way to the corner of the yard in order to harvest your herbs, you're going to be less likely to use them, which again is fine. You can grow them as ornamentals, but do plant them where you're noticing them, where you can keep an eye on them, help keep them maintained, and then also just grab a handful to use in your dishes that you're preparing that evening or your baked goods. That's another thing. In terms of size, herbs don't take up a lot of space, which is really nice. And so if you are a raised bed gardener or you're growing in containers, most individual herbs only need about a square foot, maybe a little bit bigger. Just depends on the plant. If you're looking to grow a sizable kitchen garden where you want to grow a variety of different herbs, you might need somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 square feet. Now, if you just want to grow basil, just grow basil. You don't have to grow anything else. Again, it really comes down to what you want and what you're going to use. So really consider that as well. Herbs will do beautifully in containers. I can't think of a single herb that won't do well, except perhaps for some of the more taprooted species. Horseradish is sometimes called an herb. That's not going to do well in a container. But thyme and parsley and basil, rosemary, sage, all of those will do excellent in containers. And so if you have space on your patio, you could always do container plants. Also think about the mature size of the herb. A lot of them will do great as border plants, and so you don't want to plant them behind something that gets too tall. So sage and parsley are going to stay nice and short. You can plant those in the front of the border. And then again, appreciate the fragrance of the plant. So I have some lavender scattered in my landscape, and I have it planted along walkways. So I have some on my front walkway and then my back patio. And every time I walk by, it's just natural inclination to stop by and, rub my hands on that and then sniff the lavender. I absolutely love it. So again, you will appreciate the fragrance of the plants if they're planted in a place where you can enjoy them. Backyard patio, if you have, an evening beverage or maybe you have supper outside, plant some herbs around there because you're going to, again, enjoy that fragrance. Oops. Okay, so a couple of combinations. This is to get you thinking about what you could plant together. So your typical kitchen herb garden would include thyme, sage, basil, tarragon, and dill. Those would be your 5 main herbs. Now you might think, I can't stand the smell or taste of licorice, so then you don't use tarragon, and that's totally fine. But those herbs are the ones that are very commonly used in the kitchen for various dishes. If you want a single color garden, and this was kind of trendy a few years ago, so more of the moon garden or the white garden, where these plants either have silvery foliage or they have white blooms, some of those plants would include horehound, lavender, and wormwood. So those are all plants that have more of a silvery gray foliage and very purple or white flower colors. And so a lot of us are attracted to more of the cool colors in the evening because we're trying to relax and we need just a little bit of downtime. Conversely, in the morning, you want to be, jazzed up and you want to be excited about some of those plants. And so we tend to plant the more warmer colors like the reds and yellows and oranges. But at night, those muted colors are more soothing to us. If you want more of a scented garden, because again, you love to walk by and brush something that again has a great scent, a lot of the mints will do that for you. There's scented geraniums, which are not edible, but those are the ones that smell like citronella. They have orange, they have rose flavored or rose scented geraniums. All of those will do really well. Lemon balm is another great one. Silver thyme, rosemary would also fit into that category. And then you could just do an entire sage garden, which is the one featured here. So I love sage. As an herb, to me, it's a little bit woolly tasting because it tends to have just a little bit of a woolly texture. But in terms of an ornamental, it is absolutely beautiful. So you can have a tricolor sage, which means it has 3 different colors in the leaf. The golden sage, there's a clary sage, and then there's a pineapple sage, which smells like pineapple. It's absolutely wonderful. So you can also do plants in a single family or in a single genus that just have different scents. You could do the same for mint if you wanted to. Site and soil conditions, drainage is absolutely essential. These are plants that need to have well-drained soil. And so if you have a soggy, wet spot in your backyard, don't use that to plant your herbs. They also need basically full sun, and morning sun is going to do better with a little bit of afternoon shade. So an east-facing landscape will be just fine. That said, a lot of herbs are going to do just fine in south or west facing. You might, if you're growing in a container, just need to water it a little bit more. A lot of herbs just don't like wet soils or having that wet feet. The one exception is mint. I have yet to see mint decline in any sort of soil condition or location. So that's one that can tolerate wet feet. But again, for the most part, well-drained soil is going to be absolutely essential. And adding mulch and organic wood mulch or leaf clippings or shredded grass clippings, any of that is really going to benefit these plants. It will help conserve soil moisture, which is really good. It's going to keep it more balanced, not too wet, not too dry. But the other big thing too is that mulch will help suppress weeds. And that is a major thing because weeding gets pretty old once we get into July and it gets really hot outside. So weed suppression with mulch is a really good thing. Fertilizer for these plants usually isn't necessary. If you tend to over-fertilize, you'll get a lot of growth, which people might think is great, but it actually affects the flavor of the herbs. And so if you give rosemary, for example, too much fertilizer, it will have all of this foliage, but it's not going to have a very developed flavor. So consider that when you're planting. Now, if you're growing in containers and you're watering those plants almost every day, you might need to do a supplemental fertilizer, but just watch the balance. Just make sure that you are tasting and making sure that you're not over fertilizing. And the great thing about herbs, they really do have few pests and disease, which is amazing. So not a lot of aphid pressure, not a lot of earwigs. They just don't get a lot of problems. And so they're a great plant for a beginner gardener. You can grow some of these herbs from seed. Some are better propagated by cuttings or even division, like chives are so easy to divide and just chunk into sections and then give away to friends. But you can do a lot from seed. So basil is easily done from seed. The photograph here is seed tape. It's a product that you can buy from a lot of the seed companies. And what's nice is that it has seeds embedded into this paper-like tape. that you then plant in your garden. So they have discs where they have an herb garden, they have discs of just basil, and you can plant those, and it makes it a lot easier, especially trying to deal with teeny tiny seeds. It gets challenging. So you can plant a lot from seed. If you're doing any sort of warm season plants, you'll start those usually indoors and then move outside once the temperatures are warmer. And again, the soil temperature, this also goes for your vegetable garden, that soil temperature really needs to be 60 degrees in the morning, 2 inches deep. So find a thermometer, stick it in the ground, and see where the soil temperatures are. Right now, I would hazard a guess, depending on where you live, that we're still in the low 50s. So we are a ways from getting to that 60-degree temperature. Plants like coriander, dill, and fennel, they can be sown directly from seed into the garden. And those are more cool season plants, so you could actually consider doing that anytime in the near future. So you can do that, and then you'll have herbs by the summer, which is great. To briefly talk about deadheading, it is very important with your herbs. And so if you're not one that is big on deadheading, especially when it comes to your annual flowers, the herbs really do need to be deadheaded, because the peak of flavor is going to be right before bloom time. But you don't want to let the plant go to bloom, because then that will put resources into the flower, which will then affect flavor. So it is that careful balance. Basil is a great example of a plant that needs to be deadheaded or pinched. And so you can use your fingers, you can use a pair of scissors. You just don't want these plants to go to flower. One year I entered some basil in the county fair. I had accidentally let it go to flower, and the judge knew right away. He said, oh, this is too far gone. This had gone to flower, and it has affected the flavor. It actually ended up being very bitter. So again, that's why it's important to taste things. Now, if you're growing anything for seed, then of course you want to let them go to flower. Examples would be coriander, which comes from cilantro, or your caraway, which we use for seed. And then again, I've mentioned how dill can be kind of a nuisance because it will self-seed. So if you don't want dill forever and a year in your garden, you would remove those flower heads before they develop, and then you just use the foliage of the dill. In terms of harvesting, it's really critical to capture the peak flavor. So this is where you're tasting. Make sure you're not letting your plants get too drought stressed, because that can affect the flavor. But it's just like harvesting tomatoes or any of your other crops. You need to taste them to know when they're at their peak of flavor. You can also smell it with your fingers and know when it's time to harvest. And the aroma can actually change. If you harvest in the morning versus in the evening, but it's been a really hot day, your plants in the morning are likely going to taste better than harvesting at night, because those plants do lose water and it can alter the flavor of the plant. It's very interesting. But again, be involved in your garden. Be a hands-on gardener and get to know your plants. So let me just run through some of the popular plants to grow, and then we'll throw it to Amber to talk about harvesting and preserving. So basil is a really easy annual that you can grow. It's perfect for containers. It does have green or purple leaves. And of course, this is the best pesto plant that you could ever have. There are other ways to make pesto. I prefer basil. The flowers are white spikes. They're actually quite attractive, but unless you're growing it for that ornamental perspective, make sure that you are deadheading, which really means just pinching it hard to make it branch and prevent flowering. That's what deadheading or pinching does. This is a plant that cannot tolerate any sort of cold temperatures, so this is one you should wait to plant until after June 1st. I have seen basil planted in early May. It generally gets a little bit brown looking. It can get some weird spots on the leaves, and that's from frost injury or cold stress. So this is a warm season plant, and use it accordingly. Dill is one of my absolute favorites. I love dill. If you're a fish person and you eat a lot of fish, dill is a natural pairing. It's great for dips, for other things as well. It's a beautiful plant, I think, because it has such ferny, fine foliage. And dill is just a very lightly scented plant. Of course, if you're doing any pickling, dill is going to be your best friend as well. So there's dill weed, which is actually the foliage, and then there's dill seed, which is the flower, which you can also use. You will want to sow this in your garden after frost has passed, just because it's a difficult one to transplant. Parsley is a great garnish. It's also used to cleanse the palate. This is a biennial, and so you'll get the foliage the first year. And you usually have Italian parsley, which is more of a flat-leafed, or you'll have the curly parsley, which has more of a kind of hard to describe, almost like a kind of a denser texture to it. You can grow either, both do really well in Colorado. Again, we're treating it mostly as an annual because we're using that foliage the first year. Really good for a lot of nutrients. And so if you can sneak ways of getting some of these herbs into your diet, you can benefit from the nutritional value as well. Chives is a great little perennial. It's super cute, it's dainty, it's tiny. There are garlic chives and there are onion chives. Garlic chives are going to smell more garlicky, but these are all in the Allium genus. They are really drought tolerant. They have really beautiful white or purple flowers. And what's great is you can dig up the entire clump, divide it out, share with friends. Very, very easy to maintain and one of the best ornamental herbs that you could grow. It is great to use the flowers in butter. So if you like to make those compound butters, consider using the flowers of chives in addition to the green. Lavender is absolutely one of my favorites. These are wonderful pollinator plants. They are very, very cold hardy if you're selecting the right ones. And again, a beautiful ornamental that could also be used for either culinary purposes or for aromatics. With lavender, you do want to consider using the English lavender or the lavandin. These are the two that are going to be hardy to Colorado. And I would actually say the English does a little bit better because you can get a repeat bloom if you cut the plant in half after it blooms the first time. The French and the Spanish lavenders, the Spanish is featured here, are the ones that you can see at the garden center in the summer, but they're not going to overwinter and be hardy. So they're great to grow just for the summer, but they don't actually overwinter in our gardens. A couple of lavender varieties to try. If the name sounds English, it's probably going to be a good choice. So Hidcote, Munstead, those are two English types. Those are very commonly found and will do very well overwintering. Provence and Grosso are lavandin. So lavandin will have a one-time bloom, but they tend to have more oils. And so if you're growing plants to process the oils, which is a whole other conversation, and you need special equipment, you'll probably be growing a lot of the lavandin. As an FYI, we do have a Lavender Festival in Colorado on the western slope over in Grand Junction, usually in July and August. I don't know if they had it last year. Hopefully they will this year, but lavender is a great place to have, or Colorado is a great place to have lavender because our climate is perfect. Rosemary is a great annual. This is a tough one to overwinter indoors. It just gets so picky about its humidity and everything else. So this is one that you would treat as an annual. It grows really well outside in the summer months. The leaves are more leathery, they're a little more tough, and you can use them fresh or dried. But rosemary is a beautiful plant to have. It almost looks evergreen and to have on the patio outside. Sage is a perennial. We mentioned sage and how it can have different colors on the leaves. We generally grow it for the foliage and not the flowers. It has more of a woolly texture, but this is a great plant to pair with any sort of poultry. But I also like it as an ornamental. It's low growing, it's not invasive, and it has some beautiful foliage colors that you can consider. Pineapple sage is the one featured here. It's a little bit different. The leaves aren't quite as woolly. They're a little bit more thin, but again, when you rub them, they have a beautiful pineapple scent. Peppermint, there's a lot of different peppermints, and be warned, this is not one that you should ever plant in the garden. Keep this one in a container, keep it contained. You will have mint everywhere if you let it escape. And it is one that can tolerate wet soils, dry soils, compacted soils, loose soils. It doesn't care. Mint is a beast. And so just be aware of that. It does actually have quite nice ornamental flowers, but of course we're using it for the foliage. There is a chocolate mint, that's the bottom one, and it really does smell like chocolate mint. So if you want a treat, you could grow chocolate mint and then add it to your vanilla ice cream. Thyme is one of the ones that we'll wrap up with. I think I just have a couple slides left. Remember, we have ornamental thyme, and then we also have culinary thyme. This is a culinary thyme, and you do want to make sure you are picking the right thyme in order to grow it in the garden. Thyme has beautiful, dainty white or pink flowers, and I absolutely love it. It's a beautiful plant just to have as an ornamental. It's low growing. It's more of a mat-like structure, so it's a great ground cover. But you can also grow thyme, of course, for culinary purposes. Very easy to harvest thyme. Just pick it and then use those leaves, which is wonderful. A couple of different thymes. There's the common thyme and the lemon thyme, both of which you can use in culinary purposes. The ornamentals include woolly thyme, which is the one featured here. And hopefully you're thinking, gosh, I don't want to eat that because it looks so fuzzy. Creeping thyme and then elfin is a great little ground cover that can actually tolerate some foot traffic as well. So it'd be nice to plant between pavers in your landscape. So again, herbs are wonderful. They really do add a nice diverse touch to the garden. They can add some diversity in foliage colors as well, and you can really jazz up your recipes. So I have found a love for using lavender in a lot of my baked goods. Make sure that you're using a culinary grade lavender. That's very important. But what's nice about herbs is that you really have success always with them. They're easy to grow, they're tolerant of a lot of gardening conditions, and they add a lot of complements to the garden as well. And I will post this fact sheet into the chat once Amber starts. It's a very long publication on all things herb gardening, and then I'll also be sure to send that out when we include the resources. So with that, I will turn it over to Amber. I will also include my email address in the chat, and again, we'll take questions at the end.
Thank you, Allison. I'm feeling so inspired right now. And I just wish that it was already time. I need to have fresh herbs in my life right now. I'm working on sharing my screen. And let me see.
Looks perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I'll introduce myself again. So my name is Amber Webb. I am the Family Consumer Sciences Extension Agent for Larimer County. I've been in this role for about a year, but I am just having a wonderful time at it. I am also such a huge fan of herbs as well. So what I want to share with you today is all of the ways that you can, oh, did I lose my screen?
You did.
Okay, let me try again. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. Is that better now?
It's back.
Okay, great. So all the ways that you can use these beautiful herbs that Allison just talked about. And one thing that I wanted to point out was I am a living example of having an herb garden close to where your kitchen is. I've had both, and it absolutely is true. If you have something just outside of your door or just outside of your window, it will make all the difference in just being able to reach out and to grab something as you're cooking. I even had, I lived in when I was in graduate school, a 3rd-story apartment in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we had a fire escape, and right outside of my kitchen window was the fire escape entrance. And so I literally just had to open up my window and reach out, and I had, I think, parsley and basil and thyme. And for some reason, they just had just the right conditions, and they thrived so well in that little window. And I used those herbs so much. It was just like a little happy moment for me whenever I was cooking. So I always like to think about that when I hear this presentation from you, Allison. So what we are going to be, here we go. Okay, what we're going to be talking about today is a couple different things. So we're going to be talking about the different ways that you can preserve and use fresh herbs. So you can see here, we'll talk about the best way to store, dehydrating, freezing, Herbal infusions, if you've never tried, are a great way to work with herbs. Culinary Uses, Herbal Teas, and at the end, I've got a recipe for you and also a cooking demo that I didn't do, but it's one of my favorite cooking instructors. So I'm really happy to share that with you. So think about what is the best way to store your fresh herbs. Whether you are pulling these in from your garden, as Alison was talking about, or whether you're even getting them from the store, there's always best practices of just make sure that you wash your herbs beforehand. You know, there's a lot of handling of herbs from the farm to the store, or even from your backyard to your kitchen, dirt, bugs, all kinds of things. So just want to make sure that you wash them. But there is a difference between how you do need to wash herbs based on the variety of herbs that you have. So I'm going to split them up in sturdy herbs and delicate herbs. So think about sturdy herbs being rosemary, sage, and thyme, those really more wintry hardy herbs. You're just going to want to rinse those under cool running water to get all of the excess dirt or whatever off of them. But delicate herbs, think about basil, mint, and tarragon. They're a lot more delicate. You want to actually submerge those in water instead of having water rinsed over the top of them, because they can really break apart in that water if you have a heavy flow of that. So fill up a bowl of water, dunk them into water really gently, and then you want to shake gently afterwards. You can also use a salad spinner. I think it's a great way to use a salad spinner to get all the excess water off. And then you can also dry paper towels, just lay them out and pat them gently. And then this picture here is another great example. You can actually store them in a glass of water until you're ready to use them later on. You can put them on the countertop in a cool space, or you can actually put them in the refrigerator, lightly covered in like a plastic bag, and that's letting some of the air get into it as well. Is another great way to do it. So I would not necessarily recommend doing that with basil. That's the only thing. I have had basil turn a little bit brown in the refrigerator in a plastic bag before, and that could have been a little bit old, but I would say for the rest of the herbs, you could be safe for doing that. So Alison touched on this briefly, but when you're drying your herbs from your home garden, it is best to harvest them in the morning. If it's a warm day, or if it's a dry, really warm, really dry, you might actually get some wilting when you harvest those. So make sure there's a lot of water already in them and that they're really happy in the morning. That'll ensure that you have a longer life in the kitchen before you start cooking with them. Again, I already talked about this, rinsing through with water and drying paper towel. And then you'll want to label when you're drying in a food processor or a food dehydrator, you will want to label them, because once they're dry, it's going to be hard to tell them apart, depending on what you have. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So if you have an electric food dehydrator, this is a really great option for extending the life of your herbs. There is a difference though in dehydrators. So some dehydrators don't actually have a thermometer or a thermostat that you can set. And I wouldn't recommend using that type of dehydrator. That's actually the first kind of dehydrator I ever got. And I didn't have much success because of that. You plugged it in and it was 150 degrees and things just didn't go well. However, most dehydrators now, you're going to be able to have a range. I have one here at the office that will give you on top of the lid a range of temperatures, and then the best, what you'll be hydrating on those. So 95 to 115 degrees is really best for herbs because they're so delicate and they don't have a lot of moisture in them versus something like a fruit or a vegetable, which is going to take a higher heat. So again, the lower that temperature, you're going to have better color and aroma after that time of dehydrator. The time can vary depending on your herbs for anywhere from 1 to 4 hours. And I do have a fact sheet that I'll be putting in the chat box at the end that will give you that range for the different herbs. You'll want to check it periodically. You can actually switch the trays. So do the ones that are closest to the heat source, you can switch them out so they're a little bit farther away. And then when they're done, when they crumble, and then the stems will break when they're bent. And this one here is some Genevieve's basil, it looks like. You can actually dry your herbs in an electric or in a gas oven. And this one is really interesting because the pilot light may be warm enough to supply all the heat that you need. Otherwise, ovens typically, from what I've seen, can only go down to about 170 degrees. That's too hot for herbs. So using that light is really key for this. If you give it a try, here's the picture of it. You just wash and dry your herbs, put it on a single layer of an oven-safe tray, and then check them periodically, move the tray around a couple times, and then when they start to crumble, when they break, you know it's done. When you're doing it this slowly, there are some considerations that you need to make. Make sure you don't have, a lot of movement of activity around the oven. You might need to have some kind of an airflow, so maybe a fresh one, open window or something like that will help along the process. And it could take a lot longer as well. You can also dehydrate in the microwave, and this is really interesting. So this is really, it's a technique that you can use that doesn't work for all herbs. So I would recommend doing this only for something like parsley. I've not found a lot of other success with herbs, different kinds of herbs. But if this is what your only option is, give it a try, make it an experiment. It's really interesting. So what you do is you just place a paper towel on your tray, put your herbs in there, dried and washed, and cover it with another paper towel. And then you put some water in the microwave with it, like a mug or a glass measuring cup, to provide some moisture. And then you're going to put the microwave on the interval of 15 seconds. And then you'll want to open up the door and then move it around. You will see, as you can see on this tray here, not all of the herbs are going to be the same size. So break them up as evenly as possible. If you can't get everything exactly even, you'll be able to pull off the smaller pieces sooner than the larger ones because they're going to dehydrate quicker. So just keep that in mind if it's something that you'd like to try. Air drying. This is actually one of my favorite ways to preserve herbs. So you can see here's a great picture. It's exactly what I'll be talking you through. You'll just want to tie your herbs into small bundles. You'll want to hang them in a spot where there's not going to be pollution. So think like a garage or something where it's going to be exposed to things. You'll want to make them in a bundle that's not too big. So as you can imagine, if the bundle was really, really thick and you tied string around it and you hung it up, you're not going to get a lot of airflow at the base or the thickness of that bundle. But maybe I would say 5 or 6 stems at a time, you shouldn't have any problem. And the best kind of herbs for this are rosemary, sage, thyme, and summer savory. And as I did want to point this out, is I started doing it this way when I had my home garden. I worked on a student farm as well out in Pennsylvania. We did this all the time. But when I got to a spot where I moved around and I didn't have a garden, you will notice in grocery stores around holidays, there will be extra supply of those clamshells of fresh herbs. So actually over the Easter weekend, I picked up a couple of extra clamshells because they were on sale. I think it's called a poultry blend, and it's rosemary, sage, and thyme. I also picked up some rosemary and some extra thyme because those are my favorite. And this is the perfect thing to do with those. Just tie them up in those little bundles, air dry them, and then you'll have them for lots of better culinary uses, and it doesn't take long. So here's another thing, another way that you can air dry. So I love this picture as well because it is very self-explanatory. Some of the tender herbs are going to need a little bit more care. And so what you want to do is you want to put those herbs into, like you can see here, a bag. So it doesn't have so much exposure. You can poke holes in the bag to get some of that airflow through, and then you'll hang them to dry that way. If you are trying to dry herbs this way that are tender, that have the seeds on them, like Alison mentioned earlier, if you're just trying for seeds, this is a really great way to catch those seeds when they're drying, because as they dry, they'll just fall into the bag. And generally, I would say with the technique for the sturdy herbs in the last slide, I would say maybe about 3 to 5 days. And I would say that is all for this method. You might need a little bit more time because there's a little bit less airflow, but it shouldn't take too long. And you can always go in and test and see how they're looking. Now, once you are done with drying, you want to store them. There are a couple different considerations that you need to make. You want to make sure that they're in airtight containers because once they're dry, they have a really great, let's just say, I'll struggle to think of the right word, just say they're at the right dryness, and you don't want that dryness to change based on your the level of humidity or heat in your house. You want to stop right where they're at. So those airtight containers, here's some great options for you, just to clean jars, mason jars. You can also use Ziploc bags or freezer plastic containers as well. You can use old spice jars that you've used for others. It's a great way. You don't want to hold any herbs that show any kind of mold or any kind of discoloration or anything that doesn't look good because probably there's some moisture in there, and that's going to take over the rest of the container. So unfortunately, if you see that, you should probably just discard what you have. And then also something to consider, you can see in this picture here, it's really great to store your herbs, the leafy part of it, whole, because what will happen is it'll retain more of the flavor. If you have them crushed and you grind it up, you're going to have to grind this again when you're cooking. But if you have it in that whole form, you'll be grinding it for the first time. Those oils will be released and it will be nice and fresh. And you always want to label and date as well. And I had mentioned that earlier because they can have a tendency to look alike. You will want to keep your containers in a cool, dry place away from sunlight. You are going to have best quality within the year, but if your herbs go beyond that, they're still edible. They'll still be fine if you're not showing any kind of mold, but you will lose some of the quality of them. So the quality will go down the longer beyond the year that you go. So as Alison mentioned also earlier, once they're dried, it's a lot concentrated. There's a lot more flavor. So if you have a recipe that calls for fresh herbs and you're using dry instead, you'll only want to use about a quarter to a third of the amount listed in the recipe so that you don't get really overwhelmed with that herb flavor or overpowering in your dish. This is another really great way to freeze or to preserve herbs, is freezing them. So what you can do, I love this picture here, is just wash and dry your herbs. To quick freeze them, you spread them out on a single layer on a cookie sheet, and you freeze them for at least 30 minutes, and then you label and store in a freezer bag. If you have whole herbs or excess herbs, you can do this whole. But what I actually have done, I'm not really sure where I got the idea, is I will use fresh herbs in my recipes, and then I will strip the stems and I'll freeze them this way. Or I'll freeze them in a bag with scraps for stock for later on to really get some additional flavor in stocks and soups when I'm making those, because those stems have so much flavor in them and you don't want to waste that. You can also save the stems from your dehydrated food and save those in a jar or a plastic bag and just use the stems as a flavor in something like soup or stock, and use it the same way you would as like a bay leaf. You just let it boil, you let it go in there, and then once your soup or stock is done, you just pull that out and discard it, and you just get so much flavor from those. And then also for ice cube trays, it's a really great way to preserve herbs. So think about making a pesto and then transferring it to, like you can see here, an ice cube tray or even a sheet pan. This I stumbled onto a couple of years ago because people were saying, I love making pesto, I love freezing it, but sometimes you can run into, that 1 inch square, 2 inch square size. It could take a little while for that to defrost. And if you want to just pop something out really quick, a cube of pesto, put it in your soup, sometimes it could take the temperature down depending on the size of your pot. So if you spread your pesto out on a tray, you can make it as thin as you want. And then you can cut it up into triangles like you see here, put it in a Ziploc bag. And then when you're ready to go, you actually just like pinch or pop off any amount that you want. And because it's frozen and preserved at a thinner capacity or a thinner amount, it's not going to take as long to defrost, and it's just a lot easier to use. You could probably top this out and spread it on toast or whatever if you're doing some kind of an appetizer for dinner. So storing frozen herbs is going to be the same pretty much as dried frozen herbs. You want to make sure to label your package just like you see here, the dates, ingredients, the quantity that you have in it, and you want to make sure to freeze immediately at 0 or below for best quality. And that will give you a longer shelf life in your freezer. You can actually get a really great amount of time out of herbs in your freezer for about 12 to 18 months. And as with dehydrated herbs, the longer you store them, your quality is going to go down, but it's not going to make it unsafe. And then for quickest freezing, you want to place your packages at least 1 inch apart in your freezer. You don't want to put a bunch of things that you need to freeze all together in one spot in the freezer. You want to space it out so there's lots of cold air going around all of your packages. And then once they get nice and solid, then you can package them up or store them, stack them however you'd like to once they get to that point. So another thing that I like to do with herbs is herb infusions. So this is 2 different ways that you can do it, but they're very different. So I wanted to point out a couple of things. Alison mentioned earlier she loves doing compound butters with chives or chive flowers. And I've done that before, but I've also was taught using chive flowers to make an herb vinegar. And it's so lovely. It actually turns a light purple, just like the color of the flowers. And using that and seeing it like a light purple vinegar in your cabinet is so, I just find it so lovely. But what you'll want to do is sterilize whatever jar that you want to use, mason jar or a little jelly jar. You'll want to put in 3 or 4 sprigs of fresh herbs. You can even do it with dried herbs per pint of vinegar. And then you'll want to use that for 3 or 4 weeks. Anytime you walk by it, every couple of days, once a day, just shake it up so that it has ability to distribute evenly and get all the way through the vinegar. After that, you'll want to strain it, and then you can store that bottle of flavored vinegar for 6 to 8 months in the refrigerator. So make sure you label that date so you have an eye on it. But I doubt that you will make that vinegar will last that long in your refrigerator, especially in the summertime when it's salad season, and it's just so beautiful. It's not something that's just going to sit there. You can also do herbed oils, and I love this picture of these oils and these vinegars here. It's a great example of exactly how it can look. The thing is that you want to make sure to do your infusions fresh. Let's say you're going to have a dinner party or you have a recipe you are thinking about planning ahead. You can make this vinegar a couple days ahead, but only about 4 days. And the thing of this is because the herbs do have potential to grow botulism or the Clostridium botulinum toxin. And that's because they are fully submerged in oil. They don't have any air, or they're not going to have any exposure to anything that's going to hold back this botulism risk. You're not heating it, you're not processing it. It's just fresh herbs in oil. Whereas vinegar is actually a food preservative. Oil is not. So if you have it in your refrigerator for longer, just know that you have that risk. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen every time, but you do have a little amount of risk with that. So just want to put that out there. I do have a fact sheet also on herb vinegars and oils that I will put in the box that will give you a little bit more information about that and some specific recipes to suggest. Herbal teas are also something so lovely to have. I have this picture here. This is a mint tea. Now, if you have some beautiful different varieties of mint, I would highly suggest giving tea a try. So you can do it from fresh. So make sure you bring them in, you wash them, and then you're going to want to brew herbal teas at about 180 to 200 degrees for 5 to 15 minutes to destroy any of those potentially harmful microorganisms that are on it, just to be safe. And then once it's brewed, you can add to a sun tea, or you can drink it as is once it's, a little bit cool, or you can chill it and drink it as an iced tea. This is such a lovely thing to do. And I've only done it with peppermint, but I imagine that some of the different kinds of herbs that Alison talked about earlier, different kinds of mint, would be so much fun to experiment with. So I want to talk through some tips and tricks that are really great for herbs. I love these photos. I really am just getting so inspired for the season. If you are in a place where you'd like to try to reduce salt or sugar in your diet, herbs are a really great way to stand in for those types of that kind of flavoring that we're used to. Herbs are such a great way to bring more life and more zest into the meals that you're cooking. And you'll notice that because of that additional flavor, you may not need to rely on salt as much or sugar for that flavor enhancement. And yeah, heat can increase the rate at which some herbs release flavor. So think about, like Alison was talking through earlier, things like rosemary and thyme and sage being cooked in fall time meals or in soups where it's heated. It's really great for that application. But things like, let's say, dill, well, dill can be cooked too, but I'm going to point out maybe like parsley or cilantro or basil really are best used for fresh applications. Putting in a salad or topping on putting fresh basil or oregano on top of your pasta, something like that. And I talked earlier about the storing herbs fresh or storing herbs dry in their whole form. And having a mortar and a pestle, like you see here in the center, is a really great way to release those oils again. So if you have, let's just say, some dried rosemary, putting it in that mortar and pestle, it immediately smell it before and after you're using it. You will smell such a difference when those oils wake up again. But also, you can use a mortar and pestle for fresh herbs. This is something that's used all over the world. My mind is immediately going to something like Thai curry pastes. If you're making from fresh, you can absolutely use fresh herbs from mortar and pestle. Or also basil for pesto. I learned actually that a mortar and a pestle is like the root word for pesto. And when you make basil pesto fresh in a mortar and pestle with garlic, with pine nuts and Parmesan, it is a different experience than if you try to make a pesto or you make a pesto in a food processor where the herbs are ground, manually versus chopped. You'll get a different flavor out of it. And I tried it, and it's so much fun to experiment with these kinds of things. Go out and get yourself a mortar and pestle just for the fun of it, just for the pleasure of it. You won't regret it. And then if there's something new that you want to try and you're not familiar with it, you're not really sure how to use it, what you can do is actually mix it with a couple different things. So you could try mixing it with butter or cream cheese or plain yogurt. Let it stand for half an hour and then taste that mixture on a cracker instead of having it just on a plane. You'll really get a sense for what that herb is like and how you might be able to use it in your cooking. And then culinary uses. I talked a little bit about this, but herbs are just such a great way to add more flavor to any of the kind of cooking that you're doing. This last week, I did a recipe where it was roasted vegetables, and it was a salad that was yogurt and buttermilk, lemon and garlic, and then it called for parsley and mint. All those mixed together, poured over roasted vegetables. It was just phenomenal. It was so delicious. I'm also thinking we're going to be coming into the summer season. You might be wanting to make some cocktails. Immediately thinking of for something like a mint julep, but I've also seen the basil mixed into cocktails as well. And I'm sure there's lots of other options too, but those are just two that might be a fun option to try. Experiment with herbs in your soups, your stews, your salads, eggs, yogurt, lamb, fish. Alison talked about dill and fish being a great combination. I've seen lamb and mint being a combo. Talked a little bit about the yogurt earlier as a dressing. With eggs, when I learned about the best way to make an omelet, the French omelet. It was the Julia Child omelet episode. And she said her very favorite way to eat omelets was with goat cheese and fresh herbs. And it's completely changed my opinion of fresh herbs in that way ever since. Every time I make an omelet, I always want a little bit of fresh herbs. And for me, thyme is my favorite. So if you haven't tried fresh herbs on eggs, do it. You won't regret it. Or as I said earlier, trying fresh herbs as a garnish on pasta, or even topping for an ice cream. So Alison had mentioned the chocolate mint on top of vanilla ice cream. Love that. We're also enhancing flavors of pickles and jams. I have a class coming up soon on jellies and jams, and also in a few weeks, some pickles as well. And so we'll talk through some of those herbs for combinations that way. And if you have ideas, I like thinking about it this way because it's absolutely the time for it. Fresh and delicious. So I'm going to show you a video of a really great use for fresh herbs in pasta. I'm going to go ahead and click on it here. Oh, it's not. Here we go. This is from the Splendid Table, and this is a woman who has so much knowledge about all things food all over the world. And this is a recipe that I found and taught for a cooking class that I taught a number of years ago, but I'm going to bring it back because it is just so much fun to watch. It's such a pleasure to see her cook, talk about herbs, and I would highly, highly encourage you to try this recipe. So I hope you enjoy.
Hey, Amber, I think you have to end your presentation and then share your screen with the video. If it's
okay. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Alison. Okay, let me go back to it real quick.
And while she's doing that, the chat is open if you have questions, because I think this is right at the end of what Amber was presenting. So if you have any questions, let us know, but we'll get the video playing.
Great.
Yeah, now we can see it. Perfect. Thanks, Amber.
Great. Yes, thank you, Alison. I appreciate that.
And then did you share the sound on your screen so we can hear it?
Share sound.
So when you share, there's a button that says share computer audio.
Okay, let me double check and make sure I'm doing that right. Thank you, Alison. I appreciate that. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Alison, for saving the day.
Yep.
Is this chopping board pesto, and I saw it on a horse farm in Italy. It's rustic, fresh, and the great thing about it is it's not cooked. So you start with a mezzaluna or a regular knife. I happen to like this. You have a little bit of garlic, a little bit of onion. You start to chop like so, and then you add any herb you've got. You want a lot of basil, okay? By the way, it should be an infant basil. So we've got basil, we have some mint, we have some chives, a little bit of thyme because thyme can take over. Tarragon, you don't think of it as being Italian, but trust me, it's used there. And then sage. Now, be careful with sage. It's like thyme, it can really take over. So just a few leaves, some salt, some black pepper, and we start to chop. I love the sound of this knife. It's really great. Using the mezzaluna is definitely therapeutic, and I think as you can see, you kind of get into a rhythm. You know, you start moving with it. And now, here we are. Yeah. Odd thing, you add the olive oil right on the board, okay? And keep chopping. When you cut different ingredients together, their juices blend in a way that they don't blend when you chop the onion here and the herbs here. It achieves a different kind of flavor. So what we're gonna do, take this, here's pasta. I'm using linguine that I've already cooked in heavily salted water. The key to cooking pasta is that the water should taste like soup. In so many words, it should be salted enough that it has a lovely flavor to it, because the pasta is not going to absorb a lot of salt, but it will have more flavor with that generous amount of salt in the water. We're going to add the tomatoes, and now we're going to toss this all together with two final ingredients: pine nuts and cheese. I used a vegetable peeler to get long strips of the cheese. And what's interesting is that when you do that with the cheese, it gives you a completely different taste experience. You get more of a sense of the cheese that way instead of grating it. So you just have to gently give this a mix, like so. And here is chopping board pesto. So I'm gonna have a taste. Okay. The art of the twirl. You know what's so good about this? As you're eating it, you can taste the mint. You can taste the tarragon. You can taste all of the elements of the dish. Each bite, you taste first one herb and then another. And you can use whatever herbs you find in the market. Perfect dish for summer. It's delicious at any time of year, but it's especially delicious in summer when all the herbs are inexpensive and they're delicious, they're in their prime.
Okay. That doesn't make you hungry. Okay, so back to the presentation. Just have a couple more here. So I wanted to also share one of the favorite recipes that I have for pesto, because pesto doesn't have to just be made with parsley, or excuse me, with basil. It can be made with any herb that you like. So one of the ones that I've come across a number of years ago was a parsley walnut pesto. And this is a really great option for when maybe you don't have basil available, or you don't have the other ingredients such as pine nuts or Parmesan. There's definitely different ways you can make this. So this is 2 cups of flat leaf parsley, toasted walnuts. I would highly recommend toasting walnuts. You'll get such a depth of flavor and nuttiness that you wouldn't be able to have with just raw. Some grated Parmesan cheese, garlic, salt, extra virgin olive oil, lemon zest, and lemon juice. And then you put this all in a blender. And then spread it on toast, put it on your pasta, use it for anything that you can think of that would just need a little bit of extra flavor. I actually like putting sometimes a parsley walnut pesto in soup, a little flavor enhancer. It's so delicious, and I love that it's also really cost effective. So sometimes if you don't have a garden available and you don't want to buy a whole thing of basil, parsley is a really great option because it's generally about 65 cents or something like that in a grocery store. So give it a try. And then if you want to put it away in the freezer for a while, you can do what we talked about earlier, putting it into some ice cube trays or on that cookie sheet to freeze for a little bit later. It's delicious. I'm going to make it today, probably. And with that, I will make sure to post the resources for you that I talked about earlier. And I think we'll be able to open up the floor for questions.
Thanks, Amber. That was, I'm starving. Like my stomach is making the loudest noises ever. There have been a couple of questions and I've answered a few about growing, but there was one from Ruth on what vinegar should you use if you're doing the herb vinegars?
Oh, that's a really great question. I would say you could use any vinegar that you like. I have made flavored vinegars with just distilled white vinegar, but it's not really my favorite. You can absolutely do it, but I have done side-by-side comparisons. One of my favorite vinegars to use is actually white wine vinegar, because it has that clear or that slightly yellow quality that will change when you put herbs in it. You could try red wine vinegar as well. Probably not balsamic, but red or white. You could also probably get away with apple cider vinegar if that's your favorite as well.
And then Amber, are your classes, the ones you mentioned that are coming up, are they posted on the Larimer County Extension website, or they
Yes.
will be posted soon? Do you want to find that link and post that in the chat? So
absolutely.
We don't have them on the cohorts blog, which is maybe where you found this one, because we try to keep those more gardeny, but Amber does do a great series of food preservation and other classes, and then she'll post that into the chat. And these are all free, available to the public. I don't know if you have registration limits or anything like that.
For my virtual classes, no, I don't. So I would be very happy to have you. And they'll be coming up just in the next couple of months. I'll do some virtual classes throughout the summer, but hopefully we'll be able to start doing some things in person before the end of the year. Fingers crossed.
And then there was a question from Kathy M. So Kathy, lavage or lavage, however you want to say that, I think it's hardy enough here, but it doesn't really like hot climates. And so I'm not sure how well it would overwinter unless you have it in a shaded moist spot. So one I haven't grown. If people have grown lavage, and I might be saying it totally wrong, let us know that if you've had good success with overwintering that. If you want to find the fact sheet, so again, the recording will be sent out. We will include the slides that we have presented in the email that we send you, and we'll also paste and include the fact sheets that we reference. So that would be the herb gardening one, and then as well as the flavored oils and vinegars, the using and preserving herbs, and the one on lavender. So all of those will be included. They're all from CSU Extension, and so you'll have access to those. And just know that you'll get that information as a registered participant.
Great, thank you. And I also just added the link to my food preservation classes as well.
Fantastic. And we'll include that in the email as well. So if you didn't get a chance to do that. So Sue has a question for you, Amber, that she gets food safe bottles at Hobby Lobby. They're nice and pretty with a ceramic stopper. Vinegar with chives, yes, star white vinegar. Can she use the bottle too? Or maybe that was an exclamation mark. Do you see that if you scroll up in the chat? I think maybe it was just a comment, actually. Sorry, Sue. Angie, this recording will be posted on the cohorts blog, and so we'll include that because we have a lot of other classes that we have recorded and made available. So you will be waiting with impatient, bated breath for the email that we send with this information. We just need to convert it to YouTube, and that takes just a little bit of time. Looking at what else? Yeah, so again, if you have questions, I'll retype my email address. I'll also include Amber's, or if Amber wants to type hers in, that's great too. We do thank you for joining us on behalf of CSU Extension. Hopefully you're getting the bug to garden and get some soil on your fingers and get that goodness going in your garden. So thank you, Amber. Thank you for your presentation, and we hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks, everyone.